to many other nations throughout the world, it has become the bearer of a traffic in ever-growing volume. The world's commerce depends upon it. It is, in fact, the greatest international waterway in the world.
The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, was opened in 1869. This allowed ships to avoid traveling all the way around the tip of Africa. The canal created triumph, allowing the nationalization of the Suez Canal, and many countries establishing new relationships. However, this also created tragedy, killing innocent civilians and causing tension between countries, resulting in war. After it opened, the canal had 15,000 ships come through each year, and roughly 80% of the ships were owned by Britain. The Suez Canal was first run by the French, Australians, Egyptians, and Russians. Ismail Pasha, the leader of Egypt during the time, owned 44% of the share of the canal, and later sold his portion to the British government to pay off Egypt's debts.
In 1882, Britain owned most of the canal, resulting in Egypt feeling as if Britain was invading their space. An uprising in Egypt, known as the Arabi Revolt, led by Colonel Ahmed Arabi of Egypt, sought to end British and French influence. Britain started to send troops to Egypt, and Egypt was defeated by Britain. Britain would now become a protectorate of Egypt. Later gaining independence in 1922, Britain still stationed troops in Egypt to regulate the country's associations with others. In 1947, the British removed their troops from Egypt, but an earlier deal with Britain conveyed that the British troops were able to stay in Egypt until 1956.
After an earlier king was overthrown, Egypt became a republic, and 4 years later, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser took power. In the beginning of 1956, the Cold War was also taking place. This left Nasser pondering a decision between capitalist West and communist East. Each side would value Egypt. However, the President of the United States at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, wanted Egypt on the capitalist side. To gain Egypt on the capitalist side, Britain and the United States offered to fund the Aswan Dam. The Aswan Dam was used to prevent the annual flooding of the Nile River and used for irrigation, a very important aspect to Nasser.
During this time, tension concerning the Cold War led Israel to attack Egypt. Israel killed 38 innocent civilians. When the Egyptians were attacked, they turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. Egypt signed a deal with the Soviet Union as they were to receive Soviet-made aircrafts and tanks from communist Czechoslovakia. This was seen as an enormous triumph across the world.
The Western nations, thinking of the Suez Canal, watched uneasily. Egypt turned eastwards for her supplies of arms, and Russia's Foreign Minister Shapilov found Nasser a ready customer.
Israel, becoming concerned, started purchasing weapons from France in order to be safe. Nasser of Egypt started to provoke Eisenhower by becoming acquaintances with communist China. Then the nationalization of the canal took place on July 26, 1956. The main reason Nasser nationalized the canal was due to the fact that Britain and the U.S. withdrew their deal, and nationalizing the canal would lead to profits to build the dam.
President Nasser delivering his fiery speech telling of his nationalization of the Suez Canal, a seizure from private interests that the Egyptian says is his answer to the West for refusing to finance the Aswan Dam. It's a situation fraught with implications. But undeterred, President Nasser raises his country's flag to symbolize his action. And although his followers hail him and carry him triumphantly on their shoulders, in London, Paris, and Washington, the fate of the strategic waterway causes grave concern.
Nationalizing the canal led the Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Anthony Eden, to see this as a major attack on Britain. He was livid, claiming that Nasser was a Hitler, and Guy Mollet, France's Prime Minister, agreed. The British and French started to secretly meet, inviting Israel as well. The Americans started to put pressure on Britain, which directed them to hold an international meeting.
Whether I believe he is good or bad depends. He did many good things, and he did bad ventures in other countries and so on, which caused turbulent things in Egypt. But it doesn't mean that he stands out as the bad guy. It was not that.
The meeting took place in London, the conference opening on August 16th of 1956. Out of the 24 nations requested, only Greece and Egypt declined the invitation. Of the 22 nations present, 18 of them supported Britain.
America, one of the four nations who did not support the attack on Egypt, believed that the attack would push the entire Arab world into the arms of the Soviets. In October of 1956, Sir Anthony Eden, Britain's Prime Minister, Guy Mollet, France's Prime Minister, and David Ben-Gurion, Israel's Prime Minister, all started to secretly plan an attack on Egypt.
Britain and France react at once with an ultimatum. Stop the fighting or we march in. Israel accepts if Egypt will, but Egypt flatly refuses. The world waits tensely to see whether the British flag will fly once more over Suez.
As expected, Israel would remove their troops from the Sinai as Egypt would leave their troops there. Then posing to protect the canal, Britain and France dropped paratroopers on Egypt. On October 31st of 1956, Britain and France would begin bombing Egyptian airfields and air defense infrastructures. After almost a week of bombing, on November 5th, 1956, Egypt was losing.
At last, without warning, Israel strikes. General Moshe Dayan, one-eyed commander-in-chief, orders the tanks into action. Israeli forces sweep across the frontier into the Egyptian desert, while Premier Ben-Gurion declares general mobilization.
The following morning, the Egyptians were immensely outgunned, leaving 600 Egyptian soldiers and forces killed. The British and French's deaths totaled to only 26. Tragically, up to 1,000 Egyptian civilians lost their lives, and many more being left homeless due to the invasion by Britain, France, and Israel. Egypt, trying to sabotage Britain, began sinking ships blocking the canal. This led the canal to not be usable for numerous months. Evidently, the British, French, and Israeli forces were working together, leaving the United Nations to turn against them. Throughout the meeting, anything that criticized Israel regarding their attack on Egypt was vetoed by Britain and France. Eisenhower was enraged at the fact that their ally Britain went behind the United States' back concerning the attack on Egypt.
Britain, whose economic standards were very unstable from the beginning, started to have major financial problems. The value of their currency went down, and the only thing that could support them would be a loan from the International Monetary Fund. The United States denied utilization of the IMF, resulting in Britain calling a ceasefire, the only way Britain could get funded. 2 days after Britain had landed in Egypt, they called a ceasefire. United Nations troops arrived in Egypt to resolve any other minor issues. The British and French had no choice but to abandon their whole entire plan. Britain and France tried to display that they still had a global power by taking over the canal, only to leave them as second-ranked powers. The British learned that it was a really bad idea to endanger their relationship with the United States, as they were no longer trusted. Sir Anthony Eden had resigned on January 9th of 1957 after lying to the Parliament regarding the secret relationship with Israel and France. In the future, the United States would now become more involved with Arab nations because of this.
The creation of the Suez Canal was a triumph for the world by allowing ships to take a more direct route to exchange goods. Therefore, more countries were able to receive imports and export their own commodities quicker. This also benefited countries financially that were unable to trade due to the long route around Africa. The control over the Suez Canal led to major tragedy. Countries fought and planned secret meetings, resulting in distrust among previous allies. Many people from multiple countries lost their lives, while others were left homeless due to the fighting to establish control over the canal.
The Suez Crisis was a learning experience for many nations. From the Suez Crisis, the canal was nationalized, which led to triumph for those of Egypt. Though, for that triumph to occur, many tragic situations were brought to Egypt, leaving many killed. Tragedy can derive from triumph, as proved through the Suez Crisis.
جابوا الأساطيل هنا بورسعيد هزموهم. هل الأساطيل نفعت معانا سنة 56 ولا بتوع المظلات صرفوا 100 مليون جنيه وطلعوا بحسرتهم طلعوا بخيبتهم.
Any war would affect us, definitely, yeah. This is not new, because the area there has been enduring all kinds of wars, and until today it's the same thing.